Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. It's Funmi Owolabi, Principal Attorney speaking here. So we're going to be looking at another cookie notice. I am doing a series on the channel right now. We're looking at cookie notices and what organizations might want to know when it comes to how to use cookies in the geographies where they operate, what are their obligations under the law, etc. So we're going to be looking at ColourPop's cookie. They've called it a policy. If you're looking for a video on where I make a distinction between the policy and a notice, I actually plan to do an entire video about the matter, but I've talked about this in other cookie audits that I've done, so take a look at those. So we have this cookie banner, that's what this is called. I love that they have the little cookie icon as well, that's fantastic. The website uses cookies to ensure you get the best experiences. Let's look at preferences. So they have a consent preference center here where you can take a look at all of the cookies they claim to use on their site. So if you're a consumer and you want to know what constitutes functional, performance, or targeting, you can take a look at those here. I like to draw attention to these buttons where I've been opted in. Let's opt out of all of them and you can see the color changes. So what I'm demonstrating here with ColourPop's site is that I don't want functional cookies to be utilized as I interact with the site. I don't want performance cookies to be utilized as I interact with the site. I don't want these collected. I've opted out. The reason I was opted in, I presume, is because I'm accessing the site from the United States. And I've talked about this with other cookie audits that I've done. The obligations that a company has depends on their geography. Your obligations as a company depend on where you operate. If you're operating in China, for example, your obligations related to your cookie notice and cookie consent are going to be different to those in the European Union. You need to figure out where you offer your goods and services first and foremost, create a data inventory, and then you need to check, how do I need to present my cookie banner? When do I need to consent my cookie banner? And what does my preference center need to look like based on my obligations under these laws? That's what your business needs to do. So I'm not going to spend too much time. I love that they have a definition of what they consider to be targeting cookies. Again, when you are working with a third-party consent management platform, you need to make sure that what they've put on the management platform is reflected in your cookie notice or policy. Okay. I'm going to just quickly do a scroll down and see when this was last updated. That influences. I'll tell you why that's important. It's important for a number of reasons. One, depending on how you use cookies on your site can change, I would say pretty frequently, depending on how often you change your products. It could change. How your business has its internal processes could change. That could influence cookies. And then the third change is obligations under the data protection laws. The laws are constantly changing, and that will influence what you put on your site in terms of how you treat personal data of which cookies are, okay? There's no date this was last updated, so we don't know for a fact. Okay, here it is. This cookie policy was last updated May 23rd, 2022. So businesses should make sure that they're very careful about when they're updating their notices and policies. My first question generally to businesses is, has your business changed since this was last updated? How you treat personal data in 2022 likely isn't how you treat personal data in 2025. Things have probably changed. The products that you have offering has changed. Your website integrations may have changed. What's happening on the back end may have changed. So really and truthfully, because this is personal data, you should be looking at changing this at a minimum on an annual basis and re-reviewing it. Even if it is that nothing has changed within the business, take a look at your notices and policies to see if something has changed, that what you're presenting to the public, which is me at this point, is reflective and indicative of what's happening internally, because a regulator is going to be very interested in that. Essential cookies are automatically placed on your computer or device when you access our site or take certain actions on our websites. For residents in the European Union, and this is really telling, I talked about this earlier in this video, geography is so important. Obligations that this organization, ColourPop Cosmetics LLC, has in the European Union are going to be very different to the obligations they have to residents of the United States, which I am. Now, I think one thing that's very interesting in, data protection laws is it follows residency. If you have passports in lots of different geographies, the data protection law is going to follow you based on where you are a resident. Let's say, for example, you are a Indian passport holder, meaning your passport is issued by the Indian authorities, but you reside in the United States. The data protection laws that follow you for now are the data protection laws in the United States where you are a resident. Now, the definition of resident, again, is going to be very different depending on the geography. So your business needs to not only look at where an individual resides that's obtaining the goods and services, but you also need to take a look at what the laws define as a resident as well, okay? We know now that at a minimum, ColourPop is offering their services in the United States based on review of the URL and then also based on insight from the cookie policy on their site. They talk about the non-essential cookies, and then they also provide insight into how you can accept or reject cookies. This is really important. Individuals should always have the opportunity to consent and then withdraw that consent too, which is why we look at the preference center that we saw earlier in this video, because I have opted out of certain cookies being obtained as I interact with the site, but I also have the opportunity now. Let's do it actually while we're on this. I can manage the preferences and then I can opt into the functional. It should be as easy to opt out as it is to opt in, okay? And businesses need to be aware of that. Don't require your consumers to have to jump through a million loopholes to find where they can manage their cookie preferences. That's really important. And in some geographies, it's mandatory, okay? There's a definition of cookies, which is good. Essential, non-essential. Okay, great. I want us to take a look at persistent cookies on this video. In another video, we can start looking and doing a deep dive into first and third party cookies. Cookies can be classified as either session or persistent, depending on how long they last after they're placed on your browser. Session cookies. Session cookies last for as long as you keep your browser open. They expire when you close your browser. Persistent cookies expire at a fixed point in time, or if you manually delete them from your browser, whichever occurs first. Now, I want to talk a bit about retention. One of the tenets of data protection law is that no personal data should be kept indefinitely. The justification internally that a company needs to think about when they have session cookies, where session cookies last for as long as you keep your browser open. So my question to an organization would be, what justification do you have to retain the cookies indefinitely? If a person keeps their browser open forever, how do you justify retaining these session cookies? Because no personal data should be retained indefinitely. And when you do compliance with a privacy lawyer, generally what you're going to encounter is an immense amount of questions, particularly when they're conducting a gap analysis, which my law firm does do. We look at what you currently have now and what you say you're doing, and we scrutinize it against all of the internal documentation that you have and then the external as well, because everything has to align in the eyes of a regulator. A regulator is not interested in the fact that you have the documentation. They want to see whether what you say is going on with your business is reflective in what you say is happening on the outside as well. You're responsible for your internal documentation and you're responsible for your external documentation. So really make sure that any provision you place on your website is reflective of what your business is doing internally, which is why it's so important to make sure that you're reviewing your public-facing documents on a frequent basis. It doesn't have to be annual. It could be more frequent. And depending on your industry, you might get different advice with privacy counsel than you might anticipate. So industry is also really important. Processing information about you contained in or obtained from functional cookies. We process information about you contained in or obtained from functional cookies in our legitimate interest of the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, personally, most consumers have no clue what this law is. And one thing I talk about in a lot of my audits, whether it's the privacy notice audits and the cookie notice audits, is make sure that your business is addressing the audience. I don't know any consumer who understands what the term process means, what the term legitimate interest is, or what the GDPR is. Consumers are more sophisticated in they understand what personal data is, but a consumer that's buying a ColourPop product is not going to understand this sentence. A general consumer, a reasonable consumer, in the legal space, we try and look at what a reasonable person would understand. And that terminology is probably something that a regulator for your geography is also going to be looking at. Legal basis. We process information about you contained in or obtained from analytical cookies. Again, we have some more legal language here. Analyzing how individuals use our website to help us improve our website and business. For further information on how we use the information gathered, please see the section entitled Automated Decision Making and Profiling. So we're actually going to look at this. I actually want us to go back to the cookie policy. We're not going to deal with that today. But what I wanted to say about automated decision making and profiling, and what I hope is on that privacy notice, is one, that notice if it is occurring. The other thing I talked about in other cookie notices is the terminology profiling. A lot of consumers don't understand what this means. And in layman's terms, simpler terms, basically, profiling is where you obtain different pieces of information from individuals from different sources, and you put it together and create a profile about that individual. So if it is occurring, it's good that they have notice on their privacy policy that it's occurring. And how you conduct profiling in different geographies is going to depend on the laws that apply to you, the privacy laws. And that might be something you need a privacy lawyer to help you interpret as a business. If you're looking for a privacy lawyer and you'd like to work with me, take a look at the description below and I would love to speak with your company. All right, I think that's the end of this cookie notice audit. I really like to see what other organizations are doing to comply with the laws in the geographies where they operate. Most times, companies don't put all of their geographies, but I generally will get clues, especially if they specifically outline it. They talk about residents of the European Union, so this is very telling that they operate in the European Union. And then again, they also have a .com website. Now, this is not indicative that they are headquartered in the United States, but it generally gives me a clue into where they're providing their goods and services, because that influences the privacy laws that apply to them. So I hope you enjoyed this audit, and I'll see you in another one.